I mentioned, I think it was last week, maybe it was the week before, that we ought to expect in the context of academic medicine, in the context of medical science, we ought to expect an increasing discrepancy between efficacy, that is to say, how good things look under laboratory conditions, and effectiveness, what they do in the real world. That gap ought to grow the more corrupt the laboratory environment is. Now, it's not a perfect comparison.
Prediction is that with increasing corruption, efficacy and effectiveness will cease to track one another closely.
Right. Now, the problem with that, which I freely acknowledge, is that effectiveness is also academically measured. So, right, if your vaccines show an efficacy of 98%, and in the real world they clearly don't work that well, but you still may exaggerate how well they do work, right? So efficacy and effectiveness will not depart as much as you would expect them to, but they will still depart. And so that should be a hallmark.
Because there may be a problem in the measurement, not because there may be a problem in the actual reality.
Right.
The prediction holds regardless, but whether or not we will have access to good data is not a guarantee.
Let's put it this way. The reason that we have laboratories is for something that we rightly call control. Right? You can exclude random noisy phenomena that would interfere with your ability to measure a pattern.
Uninvited monkeys, for instance.
Uninvited monkeys,
hurricanes.
The effect of the weather. All of these things are excluded by a laboratory. So control is a good thing, scientifically speaking, but it has come to mean something else, I'm afraid, which is the ability to control the story, the ability to make the data set reflect something that it in fact shouldn't reflect.
Indeed.
And the point is that's harder to do in the real world. So the departure between efficacy, which is the laboratory version, and effectiveness, which is the outer world version, is an indicator that something corrupt is afoot. Similarly, I would argue there is a gap between climate models and what I would call integrative measures, phenomena that integrate and mind you, I believe we have reason to be quite frightened about climate change. And that reason... Anthropogenic climate change. The reason that I believe that we should be quite frightened about it is that the methane clathrates, which are frozen in the Arctic, are potentially, at some threshold point, able to take the question of the temperature of planet Earth completely out of human hands. And basically... the possibility of a positive feedback causing temperature to run away is there, right? How close we are, I really couldn't tell you. But what I'm arguing is that as the field becomes intolerant of heterodox perspectives on climate, right? In other words, let's say global warming is real, right? But it's a complex phenomenon. Some papers will reflect it's not as bad as we feared. Some papers will say, oh, it's worse than we feared. That's what you would expect in a healthy environment. But what if politically the environment inside academia is unwilling to tolerate anybody who comes up with a result that is not alarmist, right? Because the whole point is, well, we need people alarmed so they'll act. So you can't publish anything that goes in the other direction, right? That's clearly where we are. So what would you expect to see if that were the case? If there was anthropogenic climate change, but the environment was intolerant of dealing with the give and take that would be involved in understanding how bad it is and how quickly it is occurring, right? Well, you would expect a departure between models and empirical phenomena. It's the efficacy versus effectiveness again. And so here's what I've been saying for some time, is that I do believe that there is anthropogenic climate change. And the reason that I believe it is because I have seen things like glacial retreat, right? That said, the models tell me, and have told me repeatedly, the Arctic should have been ice-free by now, right? And it never is, right? And the snows of Kilimanjaro should be a thing of the past. They should be effectively a historical artifact. They're not gone. The glaciers have retreated, but they're not gone. I was told that Glacier National Park was going to be ironically named because there'd be no glaciers left in it. That's not true. And so, anyway, my point is you can't spin a glacier into retreating. Glaciers don't care what we think or say, right? They simply respond to things like albedo and, actual weather phenomena. So you would expect in a case where the field was corrupt, you would expect the models to be alarmist, and you would expect the glaciers to be less alarmist, right? And that is in fact what we see. Now, again, I'm not telling you that I don't think we should be very concerned and proactive about global warming. I do think so. Why? Because if we cross that threshold in the Arctic, then this is going to become an academic question in which we don't know how many people a world following that positive feedback can support or what quality of life they will have, but it's not something that we would rationally risk, right? We have a world that functions well, right? To disrupt it in the hope that it will function well on the other side of such a thing is the height of folly. And so, anyway,
your third example.
My third example is the double standard involved in the January 6th hearings and all of the things that look like it, right? In an environment, so the departure between the actual pattern of, let's say, political violence, which is to say it's coming from both sides, and it is increasingly common, and the portrayal, which is entirely one-sided, that gap measures the same thing, right? The point is, it is a measure of the corruption of the entities, and in effect, well, if we go back to what I said about the Clinton administration again, the way these parties function now is they have real constituents, that is to say, the people who pay, right? These are industries that pay for influence. And then there's the winning of influence by manipulating enough voters to vote for them that they actually have some power to monetize, right? So that game looks like a committee that is obsessed with getting to the bottom of January 6th because of the threat that it poses to the country, when in fact what it's really trying to do is whip its voters into a frenzy so that it can monetize the power that those voters generate for its real constituents, which are corporations, right?
Any country that is actively trying to whip its people into a frenzy is at odds with itself, because that's an inherently anti-patriotic act.
Yes, whipping one fraction of the population into a frenzy against another is a tried and true tactic for keeping people from realizing who their actual enemies are.
Indeed.
But anyway, that's where we are. So I'm going to argue that those three things are variations on a theme, hallmarks of corruption in three different contexts. Anyway, here's the point. To the extent that peer review is an active corrupter of science, right? What you will note is a departure between the value. That is to say, preprints are inherently noisy because the work is inherently of many different qualities, including crappy, right? So peer review gets rid of a certain amount of crappiness. There's a quality control aspect that actually does work, right? And then there's a corruption aspect, which the question is, well, what's the net effect? Did the work that comes out of peer review get better because it's less noisy, or did it get worse because it now has a bias?
I would say there's actually a third thing too. So there's a perhaps quality control. We hope. It's supposed to be about quality control. We know that there is corruption, but there's also a standardization, which I think isn't exactly either of the first two, right? Where good science can actually look a lot of different ways. And in general, scientific journals require that you tell a story that your science looked a particular way. And if so that either forces people who didn't do science that looked standard but was good to lie about what they actually did and thus get into the habit of lying about what they did, or that work doesn't get published. And so this, so good work that doesn't fit the style, really, like the guidelines for what it is that we expect science to look like now, also will tend to end up on I'm going to mix my metaphors here, the cutting room floor, with regard to not getting through peer review and not ending up published in journals.
All right. So I will rephrase it slightly. I will say peer review does many things. One of them is a perfect analog for censorship. Peers censor perspectives they don't like. They steal stuff. They will prevent an underling from publishing something, and then they will publish it themselves.
Yep.
Right? That happens. The joke is peer preview. Right? So it does many different things. But one of the things that it does is it censors views that are out of step with whoever is powerful in the field. And maybe most crucially, knowing that your paper has to go through peer review causes people to self-censor. It causes them to, probably bias their own results. It causes them to pursue things that they think are liable, because an investment in a project is an attempt to rise through the ranks. You don't want to write a paper, even if it's a really important paper. You don't want to write a paper that's not going to get published because it wastes time that you could have spent getting ahead. So people are adjusting what they do in order to get through peer review, knowing what the biases of the peers will likely be, especially in a field where the biases are intense. But anyway, I would argue what I've seen, and frankly, in public, people have a much better, they have a much more, they believe in peer review more than people who've actually seen how the process works, right? The powerful people like peer review because it's a tool that they need, but basically everybody's got stories about what's happened to them in peer review and how disgusting a process it is, and the public is just not really aware of it. But so the point is, it could be that peer review falls well short of what it's supposed to do, or it could be that it makes things actively worse. Right? That it's, instead of a value added, it's actually a value subtracted process, which is what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic when things were moving too quickly for peer review to catch up. And we were all looking directly at the preprints, right? Was it noisy? Oh, you better believe it was noisy, right?
It was amazing though. It was the Wild West.
It was the Wild West. But the point is, look, noise, that's what you train for in science. You train to get rid of noise so that you can see signal in spite of it, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing. And the idea that the public needs to be protected from the noisiness of unpeer-reviewed papers, bullshit. What they need are people who are good at science, who are good at figuring out what patterns are, who are good at looking at a paradox and thinking, well, what does that mean? Is there something in the methods that would have caused them to find this result that doesn't sound like something that we would expect, right? That's the process, and that's actually what our live streams started with.
That's right.
Right? We started by just diving into this stuff that was emerging so quickly, and the fact is, it worked, and not just for us, right? So the point is, the preprint literature has a value. Peer review, it's value subtracted is the point. And the gap between the value, the signal, here's the thing. Peer review should, if it worked the way the brochure claims, it should subtract noise and it should leave signal so you can see it. The question is, how much signal is peer review eliminating? Right? Signal that's inconvenient for somebody with power, right? Whether it's a school of thought, whether it's a corporation that funds a lot of the research in some area. The question is, why is signal being lost to peer review, right? Yeah. And that's really the damaging thing. And I think it is another one of these gaps, right? Oh, there's signal. You can see it in the preprint literature. Where did it go? Why is it not in the peer-reviewed literature? Why did it get eliminated as if it was noise, right? That's what we see. And we, increasingly we see crazy things like papers with important implications that are retracted. And then you go and you look and you say, well, why was it retracted? And it turns out the retraction is not based on sound science, right? It's subtracting signal, right?
Yep.
And,
value subtracted.
Yeah.
Yep, that's good.
Science cannot endure that environment. Science is a powerful process that is very delicate. It requires an open environment, and that is being lost.